Today on the Leaning Towards Change podcast, I have my guest, Mark Graban. And Mark is here speaking to us today about his life, his newest book, and a lot of other things PI related. So, welcome, Mark. Nice to have you
Well,
today.
thank you for having me here, Tanya. It's good. It's really nice to be your guest on the show.
My very first podcast guest. Super excited about this. I wanted to kind of reel it back, and that's the reason why you were my first guest on the podcast. So, really wanted people to learn that I'm a big fan first and
Mhm.
foremost, and so
Thanks.
you're one of the first people when I started learning about PI and starting on my PI journey. One of the first people that I really was interested in wanting to get to know more about and learn more about what you were doing. And so we connected. I started on my journey in 2007 and connected with you, I believe, in 2014.
hmm
And then, of course, we met in person at the Kinexicon in 2017. So, can you tell everybody a little about the history of how you got into PI, which we know kind of what attracted you to it and what you most love about it, and kind of how you got started?
Well, sure. So I got started like a lot of people who do this type of work in manufacturing. I'm an industrial engineer. I started my career in the automotive industry. So that's a little stereotypical PI lean background. I was working at General Motors in Michigan, where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because, in the 2 years I was there at GM, when I came in 1995, it was not at all a process improvement driven culture. It wasn't what we might, call a lean culture or a culture of continuous improvement. It was a culture of yelling and screaming.
I've been there.
Managers would yell and scream. I hesitate to call them leaders. There was a lot of yelling and blaming and stomping and spitting. But then about halfway through that 2 year time at GM, new plant manager. He was a GM career leader, but as he later told me, he had the opportunity to go to California,
Mm-hmm.
Fremont, California, which was the former GM plant that reopened as a joint venture with Toyota called NUMMI. So there were a couple things that happened then in that second year at General Motors. One was that we were finally able to tap into Larry, the new plant manager, was really able to tap into process improvement people who had been hired and brought in from other companies,
Mm-hmm.
brought in by headquarters, assigned to the plant. And a lot of times, people say, I'm here from headquarters, I'm here to help.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes local leadership doesn't want that.
Mm-hmm.
Local leadership in that plant did not want that. So these people were very underutilized and unhappy. They were mentoring me. I'm wanting to learn this from them. I'd been exposed to lean and the Toyota production system in college. And I had some exposure to the work of W. Edwards Deming, who was really influential on the Toyota.
One of our forefathers of quality, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? Right.
Yeah. So I think one of the key lessons learned there was the role of the top leader in
Mm-hmm.
that context. Really, I mean, like it was one factory within huge global General Motors, but almost the only thing that mattered was the plant manager.
I
And
gotcha.
changing that plant manager really unleashed not just the process improvement people who could now finally go do the types of things that they would want to go do. Larry was managing in a different way, and I was starting to see the culture change and the impact of a leader on that. So, fast forwarding some time here, I'll skip some steps or we'll run out of time. I went to grad school, studied lean and engineering and business. I wanted a career in manufacturing leadership. That's kind of what I was aspiring to. And then in 2005, and we've moved around a lot for my wife's career. 2005, we were moving here to the Dallas Fort Worth area. That put me on the job market. I
Mm-hmm.
was still working in manufacturing. I wasn't running away from manufacturing. I was doing process improvement work in that setting, but I had an opportunity to do similar kind of work in healthcare, which I thought, well, that's an interesting opportunity. Like either it's a detour and I'm going to learn a lot, maybe, and then go back to what I thought my career path was going to be. But now here we are, 18 years later this month. I still do most of my work in healthcare. I still do work in other industries sometimes because this isn't about how to build cars. This isn't industry specific. I think the
Absolutely.
process improvement methods I've learned and try to coach others on. It's about people. It's about organizational
Absolutely.
dynamics and leadership. That's all very transferable if I can kind of help convince people to see it that way as well.
likewise, and I think that you brought up a good point. It is something that is universal. So it's just really about the processes, right? Improving those processes,
Mhm.
regardless if it's in healthcare or in manufacturing. Which actually, I started out in a above ground coal mining
Oh,
operation of all places,
uh-huh.
and so that's when I learned about Lean and Six Sigma. And my very first book that I'd ever read was The Toyota Way,
Mhm.
and so and it's sometimes if you're that person that you love processes and the way things work, it was just one, I was instantly attracted to the methodologies.
Mhm.
It was like in my DNA, so to speak,
Right.
something that came naturally to me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure likewise for you, right? Um, and it was one thing because you always question why things work the way that they worked and why people do things the way that they
Mhm.
do them. But with that, it's questioning why people sometimes do them the same way but sometimes it's because the way they're trained, right? And
Mhm.
comes down to that. But one thing that I want to talk about is part of you working in healthcare. So when you started working in healthcare, what did you see in healthcare compared to being in manufacturing?
There's a couple ways of looking at it. So I think I kind of wiggled away from answering part of your first question of why
Mm-hmm.
this type of work is so important to me. So I think, as I kind of alluded to back in the GM experience, not a good environment when it's a culture of yelling and screaming and
Right.
blaming, and it's just a sad place to be.
That finger
People
pointing culture, right?
finger pointing culture, a culture that wanted people to follow the process, even if the process was bad. Like, but
Right.
we need to improve the process. We have business issues that we need to address. People are driven generally to want to do better. So I think part of my mission is believing that safety and quality are the most important things.
Mm-hmm.
The new leadership at General Motors supported that idea, which is great to be a part of. And then shifting away from the blame game and starting to engage people in improvement and to listen to them. What are their needs? What are their ideas? And so when I came into healthcare, I don't, trying to think back to like what my original expectations were. I figure on the whole, everybody in healthcare is a tick or two higher in terms of their formal educational attainment.
Mm-hmm.
The frontline workers at GM had high school degrees, maybe. Frontline workers in healthcare often have bachelor's and advanced degrees in nursing, pharmacy, laboratory. There's a lot of support roles where that's not required, but it's a really well-educated industry,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an industry where people really care. Like it's a calling, as a lot of people would say. Then I think it was kind of a surprise to see some of the healthcare culture and workplace environments, which sadly and surprisingly reminded me more of General Motors.
Where it was kind of two steps behind in a way, right? We needed much more process improvement in healthcare, so to speak. Or this is what I've seen traditionally. Healthcare needs from the standpoint of manufacturing is essentially where Lean and Six Sigma got started.
Mhm.
And so coming into healthcare, what you see is sometimes in ways they're light years behind even manufacturing because it wasn't initialized there first, correct? Is that
And
what you see?
yeah, yes, and I think that there's some other habits in healthcare that get in the way. So I think part of what we learned through the lean mindsets is not to blame the individuals. They work in a system.
Absolutely. Yep.
What is the impact of the culture and the system? And again, the culture may emphasize, we trained you to do it this way, do it that way or else.
Mm-hmm.
No room for improvement. We can't change, we can't improve. It might be a culture where we hear this a lot in healthcare: naming, blaming, and shaming. Like the manufacturing people weren't clever enough to come up with the little rhyming phrase there,
We have
but
a lot of little
uh,
nomenclatures in healthcare, right?
it's I mean, it was discouraging because I think it's not, we think back to why are processes not meeting the needs of patients, not meeting the needs of staff and providers and caregivers.
Absolutely.
It's not that they don't care, it's not that they aren't trying. In some cases it might be a lack of training, and I would call that a systemic issue.
Mhm.
Like a nurse comes in, has his or her formal training and education and license, but then there's always some element of training of, well, here's how we operate here,
Mhm.
here's our EMR system, here's our processes, and sometimes that training has some gaps, right? So then when we step back to culture, if people are told basically stop pointing out problems, stop complaining. That's not an environment where we're going to have improvement or anything close to world-class care. So, I mean, some of the problem statements in healthcare are real and serious when it comes to patient safety, employee safety, quality of outcomes,
Mhm.
waiting time, cost, morale. There's a lot of people who leave healthcare because of the workplace environments. There are some really serious challenges where I think like the status quo of the way healthcare organizes work, manages work, improves work, leads people, like that status quo, just
And from
it's
a
not
lean
good
perspective,
enough.
that's one of our 8 waste, right? Wasted skills and
Hmm.
wasted talents and things like that.
Right,
When people get burnt out in an organization and they don't feel like their voices are being heard, they
right.
want to go somewhere else. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
And I think we shouldn't blame people for getting burned out. That's, I think, a reflection of the culture that they're working in. If they're not finding the right support, and I think it seems to be deeply discouraging to people in healthcare where this phrase "moral injury" gets
Mhm.
used. It's not even burnout; it goes deeper than that. Of people feeling this tension of saying like, well, I can't follow the Hippocratic Oath. I can't follow the guidelines that we should be, or I can't provide the care that we need and want to be providing. Like that's deeply distressing
Right,
to
right.
people in healthcare, and we can turn a lot of that around,
Absolutely.
but not by sending them to resiliency training. I think we've got to change the culture, lead differently, make the work easier, make the work less error prone, give nurses and other caregivers more time with the patients instead of more time fighting fires. Like, and fighting fires is not process improvement.
And I think the other thing too is really listening to their voices, listen to them, let
Mhm.
them be part of the changes. And which
Right.
is really a change management concept, have them be involved in the changes instead of pushing changes on people,
Hmm.
but have them be the change, so to speak. So that
Yeah.
way they feel like they're included and their voices are being heard. And then I think there's less people leaving when they feel like their voices are heard and that they're actually important as part
Hmm.
of that process flow. So
Well, and I know of one case example. It's part of Duke Health System, Duke University, and their home care and hospice um, line of service. Their turnover rates were something on the range of like 80% annually,
oh wow.
and going into someone's home to provide care can be really dangerous.
Mhm.
There's a different dynamics in somebody's home environment. That is not a controlled environment the way a clinic would be. So whether it's dogs or family members or who knows what, there are dangers and there's harm and injury to people who are going into someone's home to provide care. And at Duke, the leadership identified that the turnover problem, was a really big problem, really expensive, really
Right.
time consuming to be continually hiring and training people. And they thought, well, we need to address systemic issues that are frustrating people and driving them away. And within about a year of doing things of listening, engaging people in improvement, not just listening to their problems and throwing solutions at them, like you
Right.
said,
Mhm.
listening to people, engaging them, giving them time, and maybe a little bit of training, but more so time and encouragement to go improve processes. And they got that turnover rate down in a year from 80% annually to 20% annually. It's a
That's a shocking
it's a huge
difference.
cost savings, huge quality improvement, and they're willing to share their story. Like I've helped them, publish a webinar, and they've shared what they're doing at conferences. And maybe we can put a link in the show notes
I
to
think
one
that'd
of
be
those
awesome.
webinars.
I
There's a
have to
lot to
talk with
learn.
them.
There's a lot to learn
Absolutely.
from what they're doing. And again, like it's transferable. If somebody says, "Well, I'm not home care and hospice," well, okay, fine, but I think there's a certain playbook that leaders, when they're focused on lean and process improvement, you get results like that.
Absolutely. That's and so and saying that you published a book called Lean Hospitals,
Mhm.
which was a book that I have used often
Mm,
and
nice,
communicate about often. As you know, I'm a fan, so I have to
nice.
communicate about those types of books, right?
Yeah.
But I think this is one. So for those people who actually are just starting out in PI and are looking, so like, what are some examples of some great initiatives that have been completed previously? I
Mm,
recommend that book to them because it gives them those examples of different universities that have worked on large
mhm.
initiatives and how successful they were. But it really tells the story of where they started from to where they've gotten to now. And so, and of course, you having Duke on, that sounds like another success story from that perspective.
Yeah.
But to kind of reel back in, can you tell us a little about your new book, The Mistakes That Make Us, and kind of tell us how that, how you got started with that book, and then give us some examples of some of the things that you discuss as part of that book?
Yeah. So here's the book, and I'm going to sign that copy for you, Tanya. I
Thank
know you've already
you.
been reading the Kindle version, but
I
there,
have,
there's still
yes.
there's still no good way to sign a Kindle book. It seems like you could do that
Oh,
on an iPad, but I'm going to give this to you. But yeah, this is the new book, The Mistakes That Make Us. The subtitle is Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. So, but first, maybe let me connect some dots back to lean. This is not a book that's all just lean, 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 lean every chapter, but I can't help but be influenced from my own experience, lean methodology, and stories from Toyota people.
right.
People who were on my podcast, My Favorite Mistake, and they tell these stories of, and I think this is a big part of quote unquote lean. Lean culture is, I think, first and foremost, a continuous improvement culture. And at least a big subset of a continuous improvement culture is a culture of learning from mistakes.
Right. Absolutely.
Reacting to mistakes, that's not the only thing that drives continuous improvement, but I think especially in healthcare, um, when we identify not just mistakes that cause harm or mistakes that cause serious harm, mistakes that almost caused harm, a near miss, or I'm trying to remember what comedian. I don't want to cite somebody incorrectly, but like it should be really called a near hit. It's, I mean,
Okay.
a near miss or a risk of, those times like, there's a story in the book. Greg Jacobson, CEO of Kinexus, a software
Hmm.
company. He's also an emergency medicine physician. So he was talking about the need to learn from the seemingly small mistakes that didn't cause harm, but give us this great opportunity for learning, right? So we try to prevent mistakes, and we can do that in different ways. We're trying to prevent medication mistakes and errors through technology and process and things
Hmm.
like that. But Greg uses the example, let's say in the emergency department, if he writes an order for 600 milligrams of ibuprofen, and somehow the nurse starts approaching the patient and notices at the last minute because they double check the medication. That's a process check, but people get distracted, fatigued. We're human, so sometimes people forget to double check. And I think
Right.
reacting by punishing them for not double checking is not helpful. You have to react constructively when somebody even points out, let's say she scanned the barcode or something, pointing out, oh,
Hmm.
this is the wrong dose. I think in a lot of healthcare organizations, that story would conclude with, I put that dose back and I went and got the correct dose and gave it to the patient. That leaves the process problem or problems that led to that near miss.
Hmm.
Those problems are still there for that
Absolutely.
nurse and for others. And so I love how Greg points out, and I try to encourage this through other stories in the book. We've got to view mistakes as opportunities for learning and growth, either personally or as
Yes.
teams, and really capitalize on everyone instead of punishing people for the mistake or just celebrating the good catch. There's process improvement work to be done, because if not, that same process problem an hour later, 2 days later, a month later could end up killing somebody.
Absolutely.
So
And
we
that,
have to learn from our mistakes.
absolutely. And I think that's the reason why, for the couple of years now that since I've started leaning towards change, that's one thing that I coach and teach as part of my classes is it's about a process problem, not a
Hmm.
people problem. Because if
Right.
the process is broken, until you actually address the specific processes and try to address the failures, inefficiencies, defects, or whatever occurs as part of that process, you're not going to solve it. So they're like you
Yeah.
talked about, it could be happen to one person, it could happen to multiple people. And so, but that goes back to the culture piece you were talking about, where a lot of times we want to point fingers at
Mhm.
individual people thinking they're the problem,
Right.
but it's not so much a people problem, it's a process problem.
Yeah. And,
So
I talked about some of this at a conference the other day. One of the attendees told me a story. It was a secondhand story from somebody he knows. It seemed like a plausible story, but I think the long story short of it, he knew somebody who was in some sort of facility that was doing high volume meat processing.
mhm.
that was probably sending out to restaurants and places like that. So somebody had loaded a meat grinder with 50 pounds of meat, a bunch of spices, went to start stirring it with a big spoon before they intended to go turn on the grinder. This sounds like a medication administration kind of situation because that person got distracted, got pulled away from the middle of their work. They had forgot the spoon was still in the grinder. They hit the button on the wall to start it. Crunch, crunch, whatever happened.
Oh
Like it
my
basically,
word.
I think destroyed the grinder. And
I'm
they
just glad they didn't forget that it was on and go back over there and, and like sticking their hand
Well,
close
yeah,
to
I
it.
mean, I was afraid at
You
first
know,
when the story was starting that there was going to be like a limb lost or
right.
worse. But the company fired that person for making the mistake. And the guy Corey who told the story said he tried telling his friend, firing somebody isn't going to prevent that same mistake. If anything, that person's learned maybe an expensive lesson. They've learned a lesson of it. Like they're probably less likely to repeat the same mistake, but that might wear off, right?
Right.
But bringing in a new person, same system, new meat grinder, same situation, as Corey predicted, and I probably would have taken that side of the wager if we'd been betting on it at the time. New employee, same situation, new grinder. I think it was weeks or months later, same thing, same situation, same mistake,
So
systemic
what happened with that? Did they let
problem.
that person go as
I
well?
don't know if they fired that person, but I think they did finally start thinking about the need for more systemic mistake proofing,
I gotcha. Preventative.
procedurally or something that would prevent the machine from starting unless that big mixing spoon it was back on the
Hmm.
wall where it needed to be. There were different levels of mistake proofing that we could try to put in place to make it harder or ideally impossible for that kind of mistake to occur. Now, in healthcare, there's a lot of intent around barcodes,
Hmm.
wristbands. People work around the problems with those wristband and barcode scanning systems.
Hmm.
And again, instead of blaming, to me, I think instead of blaming people for making that quote unquote mistake of working around the broken process, we need to provide a process that works. And if it's not working, listen to their concerns.
Absolutely.
Don't yell at them for being a troublemaker. Engage them or provide solutions that protect the patients and protect the caregiver from being what some people call the second victim in a harm incident. So I'm really passionate about this idea, not just in healthcare, but all sorts of businesses. It comes down to leaders and how they react to mistakes. Instead of punishing people, help them improve.
Right. And that's where you go back to traditionally, you talk about culture. So it's really about improving the culture, but
Mhm.
more so from a leadership perspective, because culture starts essentially from the top. And
Yes.
so in saying that, it's really, a lot of times what I've seen is a lot of those people on the front lines know where the issues are, but the leadership is not talking to them. And so it would be nice as we move forward if we could
Mhm.
somehow communicate it to the world that, hey, you have a see something, say something type culture to where you don't get punished for issues that occur, but more of, hey, let's talk about this and see what learning opportunities we can, what we can learn from of these things that happen, and how can we grow it
Yeah.
and move on from there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like you said, it's see something, say something, solve the problem, and then share
Absolutely.
what you've done. I think
That's
that's a
good.
constructive PI, continuous improvement culture. Because then we can think back to the reasons. I think seeing the problems, that's not the bottleneck in this whole journey. It's helping people feel safe to speak up
Absolutely. And not be scared. I mean,
and to
there's a lot
eliminate
of
the
S's
fear.
here.
Eliminating the fear.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely. Yes.
instead of telling people, you should be brave, or I've heard people in healthcare get lectured sometimes. I don't like this. I'm like, it's forgive the finger wag, but it's usually
No, I
accompanied with the
gotcha.
finger wag. It's your professional responsibility to speak up. So try telling that to a tech or a nurse in the operating room. It's your professional obligation to speak up, and if the surgeon and others are not open to being challenged or to have someone raise a concern,
Hmm.
I wouldn't advise people that you should speak up and put yourself in a position to get punished or fired. Like that seems really unrealistic and unfair.
Well, and I think from the person that's doing the work's point of view, that also it doesn't just it puts the limelight on them to where everybody else in the room knows that they're the ones that actually spoke up and said
Mhm.
something. So that makes them feel really uncomfortable and could eventually be attacked later on, outside of that moment in time.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine how they felt vulnerable after that.
Right.
So, but speak about psychological safety
Mhm.
and how you mentioned that in the book, and what that means for people and how we can improve upon that as we move forward.
So I'm going to try to synthesize a couple different definitions from people like Professor Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School, Timothy R. Clark, who he has a PhD, but he's out in the private sector, a company called Leader Factor. I did training
Hmm.
with him and have learned a lot from them both. But so to synthesize, my understanding is that psychological safety is an environment where people feel, and I'm an engineer saying the
Hmm.
word feel, right? But it's totally about perception and feeling. Do you feel safe to speak up
Hmm.
about different things? Well, first off, do you feel included? Do you feel safe to be yourself? Do you feel safe to learn and ask questions? Do you feel safe to speak up about problems and opportunities for improvement? Do you feel safe to disagree with the boss? Like, for any reason, do you feel safe to speak up for any reason without the fear of punishment?
Right.
Whether that's being ignored is a form of punishment, being chastised, being demoted, being fired, being
Hmm.
punished in different ways. So, psychological safety is a culture, but it's an individual perception. If you have 10 people in a team, I'd almost guarantee all 10 of them don't feel equally psychologically safe, right? So, it's not a yes, no. Do you
Hmm.
feel safe or not? It's more a degree of how safe do you feel? How much risk do you think there is in speaking up in this moment, in this situation with these people? So it's highly individual, highly situational. So it's not the type of thing where, again, like we tell people, you should be brave. These people by nature might be brave in all sorts of elements of their life.
I
But
mean, they're
then,
in healthcare, right?
and then in this
Yeah.
workplace, they've been taught basically just, shut up and keep your head down and don't make waves.
Mm.
So it really, like you said a minute ago, it really starts with leadership. Are they modeling the behaviors that they want to see in the organization, and are they rewarding others? So I think it starts a lot of times with a leader. Greg Jacobson at KaiNexus, in his role as CEO there, admits mistakes and talks about his actions, why he thinks he made a bad decision, assumption, bad information, what have you. But then more importantly, like, what did we learn? What are we doing differently? Sharing that with others. That sets the tone and the example that makes hopefully makes others feel safer. I think I can do the same thing. They could be
Mhm.
wrong, right? Maybe the boss says this rule's only for me, not for everybody else. But Greg, thankfully, has really acted in ways that build that culture. While not perfect, I think is noteworthy of it being a culture of people not getting yelled at, mocked, ridiculed, punished in different ways for making mistakes. It's a culture where, generally speaking, people will voluntarily admit and share for the purpose of not shaming themselves or being shamed, but to help the team. It's like, hey, I made a mistake. You might make that same mistake. Let's learn, instead of everyone learning from their own mistake. That comes down to leaders creating that environment.
So, do you think it would be fortuitous for groups or departments to maybe even have a short session before they even started in their day? Like, hey, can you tell us about some things that happened yesterday? Or, are there anything, is there basically make it open discussion, open forum? Or are there things that you feel like, this happened or that happened where, it makes them feel comfortable in their own skin and speaking about safety events or near misses and things like
Yeah.
that?
I think it's good to ask those questions and to encourage people to speak up. But I've seen far too many huddles where, again, not because these are bad people, not at all, a huddle full of people have their arms crossed, they're staring at their watch or at their feet, just waiting for this thing to be over. Does anyone have any incidents to report? And just everyone stands there quietly. So, I mean, it's one thing to encourage
Hmm.
people to speak up, but that's often not enough. And it doesn't even mean the leader who's asking is creating fear, but people may have had this really ingrained in them. It could be a
Hmm.
new leader, and it might take time to
Right.
build trust. And I think, again, for a leader to lead the way, with the vulnerability of even the simple act of saying, I've got an idea. I could be wrong, or it might not be completely correct. Hey, help me. Do you see anything that needs to be better
So
about this
asking for feedback.
approach, asking for feedback, not having to always be right, not always getting your way, and instead focusing on the better way. I think leaders can do things like that that help build trust. And then others might, maybe in small ways, say, like, I think this leader's cool if I push back. They just invited it. It could be a trap, but let me test the waters. And then when
Hmm.
that gets rewarded, people, that starts moving the culture, maybe in, baby steps
Right.
in small ways. But, you can try to give education about psychological safety. I think a lot of that education has to be given to leaders so that they hopefully feel safe reflecting and learning and admitting that they're not perfect. Because guess what? Their employees know they're not perfect. There's no facade of perfection.
No such thing as perfection,
Yeah.
right?
So being able to admit our shortcomings or mistakes, we all make mistakes, but not everybody learns from them. So I think that's one of the big opportunities out there.
Good deal. So, from the perspective of, we talked about psychological safety, but so as far as some of the other books that you've written out there, I know that you have podcasts as well. Like I said, everybody, I'm a big fan. We've already talked about that. So,
Thanks.
tell us some of the other books that you've written,
Mhm.
other than Lean Hospitals, and of course, The Mistakes That Make Us, and kind of how you got started on your path of doing that,
Mhm.
and then, of course, what is your greatest mistake that you'd like to discuss with everyone today?
Okay. You're gonna have
That
to
was several
you're gonna
questions,
have to
so
rein me in and keep me on track. Look, it's your first time hosting a show. I still have a bad habit of sometimes combining. Sorry to call it a bad habit for me. I'm pointing that at me of combining a bunch of questions into one. So keep me on track. Here's your opportunity to practice your
good
interviewing.
deal.
It's okay. So yeah, the different books. Lean Hospitals. First edition was published in 2008. Third edition, I think, was 2016.
2016 or 2017, I think.
There,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe 2017. Roughly 5 years between editions. So, I mean, I had started by blogging, writing articles, and that kind of led to an introduction to the people at a publisher who saw a market need for somebody to write an introductory lean book for healthcare. So that kind of started some of that conversation. I thought, okay, I think I can do this. I could have been wrong, but I tried it,
And here you are.
and so that book's been translated in I think 8 different languages, which is really an
That's
honor
awesome.
and really gratifying. I mean, and not to make it all about me, it just shows this is a global challenge and opportunity in healthcare. There's lean healthcare activity going on, maybe not Antarctica, but and literally every other continent. And so
Maybe we need it to happen in Antarctica too, right? You never
yeah,
know where there's a hospital over there.
there's probably process where there's work being done, there is process improvement opportunity.
Absolutely.
That's fine.
Healthcare or not.
Yeah. So then, second book that I co-authored with a friend of mine, Joe Schwartz, who's worked at a health system in Indianapolis for a long time, Indiana more broadly. I'm the consultant who's bounced around and worked with a lot of different organizations. He's the type who can stick with something and be at that health system a long time. But we kind of compared. We had similar training and philosophy when it came to Kaizen or continuous improvement,
Hmm.
how to engage everybody every day. And so we wrote that book together because I think I kind of had a breadth of experience in helping people get started. And then Joe had this great depth of experience. So we wrote Healthcare Kaizen together. We did a version of it called the Executive Guide to Healthcare Kaizen. Next project, I think, was about 2015. Was a book called Practicing Lean,
Hmm.
where I did kind of the Huckleberry Finn thing. And I wrote the first 2 chapters. And I ended up getting 15 other people I knew really well or just a little bit, to all write a chapter on this theme. And this was kind of a precursor um, to the mistakes that make us. Generally, the theme was talking about practicing lean, the way people get to practice medicine,
Hmm.
nursing practice. Like, that's a great word. We should all be practicing and getting better
Hmm.
as we go. And so that book was really a celebration of looking back and sharing mistakes that we made early in our careers. Give ourselves grace, be kind to ourselves as a reminder, again, pointing at me, don't be so critical. And don't forget, when people are new to something, they're going to make mistakes. That's natural. Maybe they don't have the benefit of a great coach working side by side with them. So I think that book project was interesting. And then 2018 going into 2019, a book called Measures of Success, which
Mhm.
gets deep into, statistical methods, but it's a management book. How do we use some simple statistical methods to do a better job of how we look at different performance measures over time? How do we evaluate improvement projects to make sure they're really a success or not? Are we moving the needle
Would you
just a
say
little bit or a lot?
would you say that one's more of a Six Sigma book more so than Lean
I
because
w-
it
I
really
wouldn't want to
focuses
call
on
it that.
Okay.
Um, because I mean, statistical process control and the method I teach, it's often called process behavior charts. That's 100-year-old
Oh,
technology,
it
if you will.
is. Right.
Doesn't mean it's outdated. I think it's like it's proven. It's like, when something has been discovered and proven to work, it's a good method. So it predates Six Sigma. It's often kind of part of
Part
a
of
Six
Lean
Sigma
methodology,
program,
right?
but you don't have to be doing, if you will, full blown Six Sigma to utilize statistical process control or process behavior charts. You can incorporate that into your lean practice or your lean management system. And I hope more people would. But I know some hospitals and health systems that are using that method, and it's really helping them a lot. Like the subtitle of the book says, react less, lead better, improve more. And those charts help you do that.
Awesome. So, from the perspective now, when you got started, so can you tell me when you got started on your journey? And I don't know if you want to. So, I call it process improvement. Some people call it
Mhm.
continuous improvement. There's multiple names,
Sure.
and of course, with that, multiple people teach different ways of doing things. But from your perspective, who is your inspiration? Who is the one that kind of got you
Mm.
started on this path that you're on? And being able to communicate with people through your writings and
Mm.
of course your podcast.
Yeah.
So true. What was it that inspired you? Or
Yeah.
there may be multiple people. So what was it that was your inspiration and got you started on this journey that you're on today?
And I'm going to say, back to when I was a employee or an internal improvement facilitator or working as a consultant or coach now, I think the category of people is the frontline workers, whether that was the frontline workers at the General Motors factory, other workplaces in healthcare. Frontline workers deserve a better environment. They deserve more supportive and engaging leadership. They deserve better systems and processes, and they deserve the ability to, contribute to improvement. And I would say they deserve to not be blamed or punished for things that aren't really their fault or responsibility when these are systemic problems. So I think I have this passion for trying to support the frontline workers. It kind of ties back to, you let me off the hook almost with my favorite mistake story, but I'll tell it quickly. The last manufacturing company I worked for, was Honeywell. This is going back to 2004.
Hmm.
And they were putting me basically through a lean black belt program. And I had previous experience in education, but I'm like, fine, I'll go through the program. I can always learn more, deepen my understanding of things, do a project. It was part of the certification. And the long story short of it is, in this one production area, I implemented some lean tools. I think I did the math correctly. I think I set up a visually managed system for
Hmm.
production and inventory control and
Right.
to help solve an important business problem they were facing. Never really got used. I got certified. I have the plaque hanging on my wall in my office, which is, the least important thing. It was a question of engagement. And so I would say, I think there are two pieces of it. I take some responsibility for not pushing back harder on a culture that didn't really respect and involve the frontline workers. There was this catch 22. Part of the business problem we were solving was that this production department was notoriously behind schedule.
Hmm.
So the catch 22 was, if I were to say, hey, look, I need to shut down production for 2 hours and have everybody work with me on this problem,
Hmm.
I know I would have been told no, because we're behind schedule. We can't stop. Like they would have really looked at me like I was dumb. Like, but I'm like, how are we going to fix this if we don't stop? Like we're just always scrambling to try to catch up. We need to stop and try to improve things. So there were some cultural elements that I was facing, and I knew I wasn't. I could catch people a minute or two here and there. That wasn't enough. I wish I'd pushed back harder. because that lack of engagement, and it couldn't lead to something where we could then force buy-in, use the system or else. There was an engagement failure, but I think I learned from that. I was very thankful. I think a big part of why I took the job in healthcare through Johnson and Johnson in 2005, their consulting methodology was not one of coming in as the expert and we're going to fix it for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they signed contracts with hospitals who said, look, to work with us, you have to give us 4 to 6 people, frontline staff, dedicated full time. You backfill, you figure out how to hire travelers or give people overtime, because that's really the only way to drive better change and more sustainable change. And I think even now as a coach or a consultant, I would say no to opportunities. If somebody said, well, come in and we want you to come in and fix things for us. I don't want,
The lack of ownership
I
when
don't-
you do it that way, it's just not sustainable. Or
yeah,
that's what I've seen
yeah,
traditionally is
I,
it's not sustained whenever the organizations don't essentially have people, even leadership, to take long-term ownership of a lot of those process changes, where you may have somebody coming into an organization to help
mhm.
promote change, but unless they take ownership of it themselves, sometimes you see it all kind of goes back to the old ways of doing things, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? So for the perspective of, we have new change makers who just found out about Lean and Six Sigma and process improvement, what kind of advice would you give them when starting on their journeys?
So I think 2 things come to mind. One is an extension of the story I told. Try to make that progression as quickly as you can from being the expert who has the answers to being the facilitator who engages others and coming up with ideas together, right? So that doesn't mean all you do is write down on flip charts. You can have input. Being a coach, sometimes you have to push people or challenge them. There's a dance there, but I
Mm-hmm.
think the key thing is, like, don't try to do it all yourself. And then I think the second piece is to keep in mind, kind back to the title of the book, Practicing Lean. This is a lifelong practice.
Yep.
And
Truly continuous improvement.
we should all be, I think, I strive for this. I could point to examples where I think it's true. I'm not perfect, but continually improving the way I do things, always learning, making sure I'm learning and reflecting from new experiences, from new mistakes. So I think I would just try to remind people, like, whatever initial training you've gone through or whatever belt, designation you might have been given, please don't view that as the end of your learning. Of like, oh, I've learned it all now, I'm going to just go apply it. Please consider that a starting point for lifelong learning, challenging yourself, and developing yourself, practicing lean.
Sharpening your saw continuously, right?
Sure.
So staying sharp and being
Yeah.
able to stay engaged. And I think you also kind of alluded to, it's not just about talking, but it's about more empathetically listening to
Mhm.
people. Because when those people do tell you, so this is what I've seen traditionally being in PI, the years that I've done this, is a lot of times people will come to us and say, I think I have a problem.
Mm.
But then usually after they say that, they'll tell you what those problems are, but don't, when they first started out with a conversation, they didn't truly know. But if you empathetically listen to them,
Mhm.
they tell you what their problems are, but the thing about it, they just don't have data to tell, like, back them up and truly tell the story.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, so as far as what you've learned over the years and helping people to do this, so what's the best advice you would give someone, they, like I said, starting out on their journey? So traditionally, when they're going to go to the Gemba to look for issues and inefficiencies, what's the best advice you can give those folks when they're first starting out, like on their
Mm.
first PI initiative?
So I think it's really interesting the way you framed that. Someone comes up and says, I think we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they could be maybe not real confident. Maybe they know, like, we do have a problem, but maybe they're not fully confident in bringing that forward. It could be that, and we can,
Mm-hmm.
empathize with that and thank somebody for bringing the concern forward instead of being dismissive in some way. And then not even just collecting data, but helping people with the problem definition,
Mm-hmm.
because people oftentimes are describing a symptom of the problem. And that's where I
Right.
think as a process improvement facilitator, somebody with experience, you have to push and challenge. And I end up doing this. And you want to try to do so in a way that doesn't make someone feel like they have the wrong answer or that they've done wrong, but to try to guide them and ask questions of making sure we're digging beneath the surface, that we're not
Hmm.
just addressing a symptom, that in a lot of cases we need to get closer to a root cause. And so again, there's that dance of, sure, you
Absolutely.
want to listen, but that doesn't mean you have to agree or move forward with everything a person says. But instead of shutting them down, it's got to be a collaboration so you can help them move
Well,
forward.
and with them doing that, they're essentially opening up to you in confidence a
Mhm,
lot of times about things that are going on. So I think that's where the empathy piece comes in,
mhm.
because you need to let them know that you truly care about them as a person,
Right.
and that their voice is important, and that they can confide in you and saying some of the things that they're
Well,
saying. You need to have that safe space, so to speak. And I think that some of the
mhm,
things you talked about as part of the earlier conversations is this is about you, and you knowing that you're important
mhm.
as part of this whole equation, and
Right.
then kind of going from there. But to let them know, first and foremost, this is not a finger pointing
Mhm.
session. This is not a blame game. We just truly want to know about the process. Because traditionally, what I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, you could have three or four people, maybe more, doing the same thing, but in different ways. But it isn't until you truly have people communicate about it, you don't know,
Right.
right?
Yep. And if somebody comes and confides in you as a process improvement person, a lot of times people feel safer coming to me as an outsider because I'm not their boss. I'm in no position to punish them. So the last thing you know I I should do or say in a situation like that, is give them grief of like, well, that's not my job. Why aren't you talking to your manager? They might not feel safe talking to their manager,
Right.
right? So it's nice that they are at least willing to take the chance with you, to see if you can respond in a kind and constructive way or not.
I think that's awesome. I think that's one of the reasons why I am so passionate about process improvement.
Yeah.
Essentially, is because it's about helping people,
Yes.
and especially in healthcare, because when you help the people doing the work as part of the processes, you're in the end result helping the patients and the patients' families.
Yes.
They may not necessarily know who you are. So to me, I think that's all worth it for me. They
Yeah.
may not know who I am, but I know that the work that I have done to help the people doing the work, so to speak, it makes it more meaningful for me.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason why I chose healthcare. I had a child who essentially, was on life support for about 2.5 weeks when he was first born.
Oh,
And so I got
wow.
to see firsthand, the importance of healthcare, and how nurses and physicians are truly needed for anybody that's and that kind of, I guess you could say, it was very unexpected when it happened.
Mhm.
But you start to look through a whole new set of eyes when you see things from a process perspective, and how simple things could end up being a mistake, so to speak. And it's not intentional, but it just
Right.
happens,
Right.
right?
It's
So
by definition a mistake is something that we thought was a good idea that turned out not to be. Right. So yeah, all
yeah,
mistakes are unintended mistakes. Sometimes
absolutely.
even in the healthcare literature, you see people writing about unintended mistakes. I'm like, if it was an intended mistake, we would call that something like sabotage or assault,
Right.
right? Because there's a lack of intent. It's a mistake. We did something that we thought was going to have a good outcome, turned out not to be. Again, like, we don't have to be happy that the mistake happened, but we need to be constructive about it. Because otherwise, people learn to keep quiet, to hide their mistakes, to actively cover them up. And that's not good for anybody involved. It might be good for getting out of trouble, staying out of trouble, but it's not good for patients. It's not good for our health system.
I agree. So I know we've talked about your books, and I don't think you've mentioned the podcast yet.
Oh,
Would you like to mention those real quick?
I have an obnoxious number of podcasts. How's that? And again, congratulations to you. It's a privilege to be part of number one. You're doing a great job
Thank
here.
you.
You've prepared a lot. And you'll keep practice. You're going to practice podcasting, right?
I'm certainly trying.
So I've been at this. I did my first podcast in July of 2006. So that was a lean podcast. That was kind of an extension of my blog. So people can find all of that, leanblog.org. So I've been doing that podcast. We're up to like almost at some point next year, if I stay on the same pace of about one every 2 weeks, so we'll hit 500 episodes.
That's awesome.
And then I
A
started.
milestone.
It'll be a milestone. We have to figure out. We have to have a party. We have to figure out something.
Hey, just ring me up. I'm ready.
And then I started the My Favorite Mistake podcast. Kind of seen on the back of the book cover here. That was a pandemic project. September 2020. I still wasn't able to go back out and travel with health systems, with everything they were dealing with, and not wanting outside people coming in. And there's questions of how safe was it. So I was home. Started that podcast. Up over 220 episodes of that podcast. My friend Jamie Flinchbaugh and I do a podcast that's a little bit more casual called Lean Whiskey.
I like that one.
A
Very
lot
familiar.
about lean, a little bit about whiskey. It's not like
just a little.
It's not like the show Drunk History. Like we're having a drink, but we're not drunk. There's a difference. I think there's a drinking versus
listening
drunk.
to the different different versions. I don't know if you what you call it, but the different bottles of whiskey and the different flavors, and
and do we loosen
how
up
long they're aged.
Do we loosen up in that second half of the episode after we've had some whiskey? Maybe. But so we've done almost 50. We're going to be at some point coming up on, we're in the 40s on the number of episodes there. And I manage episode for Kinexus, the software company that we work with. I previously hosted and produced a podcast series called Habitual Excellence that was very healthcare focused. That was kind of run through a consulting firm that I used to be a part of called Value Capture. Lots of podcast projects. I read the audiobook version of The Mistakes That Make Us, and that just came out yesterday as we're recording this. So
well, congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. And if somebody can't stand the sound, I don't want to listen to my own voice. Hopefully there's not many people out there who can't stand the sound of my own voice. It's out there a lot, I guess.
I have that, I guess you could, that little Texas slang, and so I remember the very first time I was on somebody else's podcast, I was like, oh my Lord, like it really rings through whenever I talk. But hey, if you don't ever take the opportunity and try it for the first time, you'll never know.
Yep.
So I'm so grateful that you actually have came on this show with me for my very first podcast.
I'm glad we could do it. It's nice to be here in person.
Yeah. So as far as other people that you consider, like for those new PI change makers out there, is there any other advice you could give to them, or any other books or podcasts other than yours? But are there any others that you would say would be good for them to read or listen to?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good podcasts out there now related to lean. I think of my friend Ron Pereira and Gemba Academy. They're just down the road, maybe 20, 30 minutes away from here. The Gemba Academy podcast, the training that they offer, on a subscription service through their website is something that I think is great and recommend to people.
Okay.
Jamie Flinchbaugh does a number of podcasts, and his books are really good. He's got a recent one called People Solve Problems. Katie Anderson's book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, is another good one. Gosh, I feel like if I start mentioning some, I'm going to feel bad
hurt some people's feelings
for who I left out.
Right.
Patrick Adams and the Lean Solutions podcast.
Absolutely.
I think also local here to Dallas, Karen Martin and her great books, The Outstanding Organization, Clarity First. She has a lot of great webinars and training videos through her company TKMG. So, but yeah, there's a lot of good people sharing a lot of good content with people. Some of it, some of it's worth paying for, but a lot of it's free. So,
well,
there you
good.
go.
So one last thing.
Okay.
So for the love of all things PI, this is not just about process improvement. So we're going to talk about PIE. So what is your favorite pizza pie and your favorite dessert pie?
Yeah. I thought we were going in the direction of what's your favorite number. And I was going to say, okay, pie. MIT graduate joke. We're
Oh,
probably obligated.
so we
uh,
celebrate it every year.
Pie Day on March 14th. There was,
Absolutely.
when we lived in Florida, the public supermarket was selling not full pies, but for $3.14, which is brilliant for Pie Day. Favorite pizza pie is one that I basically learned of at a place called Pizzeria Bianco in Phoenix, and I've
Oh,
tried
nice.
recreating them when I make pizza. Um, it's not a red sauce pizza. The base of it is olive oil, and my variation is to use lemon olive oil, grated Parmesan cheese, very thinly sliced, almost shaved red onion, some salami, and then when it comes out of the oven, some chopped up pistachio. And I know that sounds wild.
That does sound wild, but now I want to
It
try it just because you said it.
it
So,
works. It works. That
all
becomes
right.
people's new favorite, unexpectedly favorite pizza. So that's the tip. The one thing. How is there a pizza I've never heard of? That's the one
So, can we
I
call
would
it a
recommend.
pistachio pizza?
It's is it called? Do they call it a rosa? So at Pizzeria Bianco they call it a rosa. So I would call this a modified rosa with salami.
I gotcha.
And
Okay.
and at Bianco, Pizzeria Bianco, they also put rosemary on the pizza, which I think that's very optional. But
Okay. Okay. And what about your pie? What's your favorite?
a sweet pie. I love
Doesn't
pumpkin.
necessarily have to be sweet. If
Well,
you.
no, pumpkin pie often isn't super sweet, but the thing I love is the can of spray whipped cream. And one of my grandfathers used to
Ah,
pile it really high
I gotcha.
on Thanksgiving, and so I take after him. He led by example, and I followed his lead.
You see some pies these days where that meringue is super high, just like going back to the whipped cream.
Yeah,
They're proud in making those meringues super high on those pies,
that's a
right?
lot more difficult to do. I can't. I'm good with pizza. I'm not. I couldn't do the meringue or the pies.
Yeah, I mean, even from a process improvement standpoint, could you imagine how many times they tried to perfect that meringue being on top of that pie? That
It's kind of a scientific formula someone developed. I don't know, but look, when we're cooking and we all make mistakes. There's a story I included actually at the beginning of chapter 7 from Chris Bianco and some advice he gave me about making pizzas. He said basically, keep burning them till you get it right.
got to keep trying,
I
but
think
that's the first thing. You always that's the first step is just to try, right? Like
every
today.
every podcast series starts with an episode number 1.
Yeah, and this may be the comical one, but hey, you never know. We'll try to make the others just as lighthearted and comical as this one is.
Well, good.
Um, so I would like to tell everyone, super excited about announcing this, but I know you've so graciously agreed to give out three signed copies of your book, The Mistakes That Make Us. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so if they could just go to the meeting notes at the bottom of our podcast,
Mhm.
and they'll be able to see a link in that
Yeah.
in those notes to where they can sign up and register for a drawing that we're going to have in a couple of weeks. And look for those lucky 3, y'all will be getting an official signed copy of Mark's book.
Yep. Happy to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for coming on Leaning Towards Change today. And I'm happy to talk with you in future instances if we ever decide to have another
Sure.
podcast. And best of luck to you with the book. I hope it's a bestseller. And
Thank you.
best of luck in all your other ventures. Thank you so much.
Thank you.